My name's Gary Roden. I'm the Director of the Asia Research Centre. And it's my very great pleasure today to welcome and introduce Clare Rewcastle Brown. And can we please make sure that people's mobile phones are off if they're not already off. Clare Rewcastle Brown is a former British television reporter and the founder and editor of the website Sarawak Report and of Radio Free Sarawak. These were whistleblower initiatives established to report on her investigations and allegations of widespread political corruption in Malaysia and the impacts on civil and indigenous rights and the environment in Sarawak. In particular, Clare's investigations resulted in the exposure of the One Malaysia Development Berhad, or 1MDB Development Fund scandal, which revealed alleged kleptocracy on a grand scale by the then Prime Minister, Najib. Public dismay over the 1MDB scandal was a crucial element in the first change of government since Malaysia's independence in 1957. And that occurred in May. The 1MDB scandal is considered by many analysts as probably the biggest scandal, at least the one exposed, at any place in the world. So if Clare's work were on this subject were submitted in the recent ERA, in Australia's Excellence for Research on Impact Factor, it would certainly get a 5 out of 5. The professional honours, accolades and recognition for Clare and her work are extensive and far too great to detail in full here. Amongst them, though, are the most recent awards, including in June this year when she received the Guardian Award by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, which is the world's largest anti-fraud professional organisation. Fortune magazine also named her one of the world's 50 most influential figures in 2016. She was also the 2015 winner of the One World Media Special Award from CNN that year. Clare's courage and journalistic excellence carries risks. Malaysian authorities had issued a warrant for her arrest and requested Interpol place her on its international red notice list in 2015. As it turned out, Interpol rejected the request, and following the defeat of the Najib government in on May 9th in the 2018 election, rescinded the warrant. Thus, rather than being sidetracked by attempts to shut her down in her reporting on Malaysia and the 1MDB scandal, she is fortunately here today to tell us about her book detailing the 1MDB scandal and her pivotal role in bringing this fight to the point that it reached this year. Thank you very much. Clare.
Thank you so much, Professor Roden, and to all of you here at the university for hosting and inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure to come to Perth, and I've taken advantage of being here to meet up with some of the Malaysian diaspora, and I think I can see that some of you have come here today. So I hope that my remarks won't be sort of telling you things completely that you haven't been thinking about and knowing extensively about, given that this was your Watergate, really, that you've all been following with bated breath, I know, for the last 2 years and more. But it's been really delightful to find that just about every time I come and talk to a different group of people about 1MDB, there's always something really new that's happened, because this is such a huge global scandal that has reached into so many areas of our international life that there's always some development. And my goodness, we've had a few over the last days or so, haven't we? Actually, I'll tip you on a rumour, and it is still a rumour, but I think that by the time we walk out of here, you may have the news of an arrest of a very, very senior politician in East Malaysia. Not Taib Mahmood, I have to, not yet. But I think that there are unravellings going on as we speak in Malaysia, and of course interesting arrest warrants in the last few days against some of the people that I have been trying to highlight the role of, in particular a British entrepreneur in the communications field, one Paul Stadlen, who I've been batting away at for some years now. A warrant was issued for him by the Malaysian government just towards the end of last week, and you know, his role is going to turn out, I think, to be a very interesting one, it's symptomatic of this advisory and consultancy role that you see pervading throughout the whole 1MDB story, and similar stories with Western professionals bringing their savvy and their contacts back in the, you know, in the developed economies to help plug in, you know, local kleptocrats and others, of course, into the mechanisms and systems for, you know, getting the money out, basically. And Paul was in there as a key advisor to Najib. But wow, on that subject, you know, what gets bigger than the indictments that we saw at the end of last week of 2 senior bankers at Goldman Sachs, and the less reported but extremely significant resignation, or I think actually probably just temporary departure pending, you know, further decisions by the bank of one of their most senior partners, and clearly linked to this whole issue. That this has reached out and caught up finally with America's biggest, most powerful bank gives you a sense of the reach and significance of this scandal. And of course, we've all known that. You know, as Gary has said, we're talking about the largest recorded kleptocracy case investigated so far, certainly by the United States. And, you know, it has involved billions and billions of misappropriated cash. And this is why, of course, you know, you're seeing so many of the players, of the international financial players, being caught up in it. And of course, it's been for a journalist, I have to admit, a very fun story, despite being an outrageous one to cover, because there's been, you know, so much jaw-dropping, boggling, outrageous expenditure to report on. And I think we've all followed the antics of Joe Low and his ostentation, the purchases of super yachts, Beverly Hills mansions by the, you know, 5 of them, I think, you know, New York penthouses, jets, you know, huge businesses, massive hotel purchases, artwork, and of course the currying of favour with all the glitterati of Hollywood. I had some wonderful stories to tell of the hijinks of the likes of Swizz Beatz and Leo DiCaprio with Joe Low and his thieving pals in Las Vegas at the gambling tables, with all the flummery that goes with that. All funded by a development fund in Malaysia. Money that was raised from the public, from the people of Malaysia, in the name of helping the most vulnerable and the most poor. And it's at that point that, you know, I think most of us are just left in askance as to how these people could have lavished money in this way when it should have been spent on much needed hospitals and education in places that we all know about in Malaysia. And of course, most disgustingly of all, I suppose, have been the expenditures by the family of Najib himself, the man who was secretly and bit by bit exposed as being, you know, the only decision maker, the only signatory behind this supposedly, as Goldman Sachs explained it to buyers of the bonds at the offerings for 6.5 billion worth of lending that it was supervising. It described 1MDB as being a robustly governed institution, independently and with several layers of management. This was completely and utterly untrue. And of course the Southeast Asia boss of Goldman Sachs, one Tim Leissner, he was actually known as Dr. Tim Leissner, but unlike our academics here, the doctor was a false one bought from a mill in East London somewhere. But none of that was exposed by Goldman Sachs. And you know, these this so-called academic boss of Goldman Sachs had described 1MDB as being, a well-managed fund. He knew perfectly well, as he was bribing Najib, as he's now admitted in court last week, he knew perfectly well that this was a fund that was totally controlled by the Prime Minister. And look where that money went. 681 million went into his own private bank account in KL. Some of that was then siphoned back and spent by Jolo on, on yachts, on pieces of artwork and other ways of laundering cash. Other stolen monies that were funneled through the Abar Sovereign Wealth Fund, these were spent on a movie to be produced by his son, Wolf of Wall Street. And of course, over $100 million worth of fancy diamonds, which happened to be one of Rosma Mansour, Najib's wife's pensions. The other penchant, I think, as probably many of you know, was Birkin handbags. At the last count, they found 274 of those $100,000 fancy bags stuffed in our house when, to their surprise, Najib lost the election in May. So how did that election defeat come about? Well, I think that's where the exposure of this scandal comes in, and that's where possibly the role of independent and free media comes in. And obviously I want to talk about that, the vital role that journalism, independent journalism, plays in promoting democracy and protecting democracy. The crucial thing about the whole 1MDB Exposé was that I was able to get the information thanks to adopting a different form of journalism to what was permitted in Malaysia, and then through the internet was able to get it out to people like yourselves, many of whom I think here are Malaysian, who went to hell and high water to get to the vote, to get their votes in on May the 9th, and that's what made the change. So perhaps it's worth, as that's the background, it's worth thinking about why it was that I, as a journalist, got stuck in to the Malaysian corruption issue. I mean, I didn't set out as a writer to start talking about high corruption, financial corruption, or indeed to get involved in tackling Malaysian politics as such. I was a Western journalist, but I'd been born in Sarawak. I'd spent my early years in East Malaysia, and I happened to be someone who was plugged into the Western media scene, who knew what a very special place East Malaysia was and the Borneo jungle was. It's the oldest rainforest on Earth. It's the most biodiverse habitat on Earth, with the greatest number of variety of species on Earth. And it's was the largest rainforest on the planet. And it was a magical place for me as a child to grow up in. It was a paradise of life. And I treasured those memories. Went back to the far less, abundant environment of Europe and grew up and didn't actually come back to Borneo until 2006, when ironically I was invited to come and speak at a media and environment conference in Kuching. And flying back over what I had this memory in my mind of departing as a small person on my own for the first time, and I travelled in that plane for 2 hours down the coast from North Borneo along and then to Singapore, and just watched the beautiful canopy below me as I left my home, as it felt, all those decades ago, and to retrace that journey over a palm oil plantation that spread for hundreds of square miles was a devastating experience, and I realized the extent of what had been done. And then when I started to dig in a little bit more deeply and talk to some of the other journalists, the local journalists who were attending that conference, and then I was able to go out and travel at that period in Sarawak a little bit more, I began to understand the extent of the environmental disaster that had taken place, and also the appalling impact on the native and indigenous and local Malaysian people who were there, who, you know, all this had been done in the name, obviously, of them, progress and modernization. But of course, none of them had received the benefits. The benefits had all been whisked away as the jungle was cut from underneath them. The concessions, the compensations, all this went to mysterious parties. And of course, behind people's hands, they would whisper to me, well, of course, the money all went to Taib Mahmood, the all-powerful politician for several decades in Sarawak, and his family members, and it left the country. This was clearly a scandalous and disgraceful situation. It was obvious to see that the driving force behind unnecessary, ill-thought-out, incredibly damaging deforestation was corruption. It wasn't public policy, and no one was benefiting. And I could see, as a foreign journalist, that this was not just, this was not just a tragedy for Sarawakians and Malaysians. It was a global tragedy. This was a global story. I think, we're all, well, barring perhaps our host country, Australia, most of the world is very, very conscious that mass deforestation and other releases of fossil fuel along the same trajectory is causing us all major climate problems, and that these are issues that affect all of us. So I started looking at this and trying to open people's minds and understanding to what was already known and whispered about, in the inner circles in Kuching, which was that all this money was going to Thai. Again, I was able to do that because of the internet, which had just at that time really taken root in Malaysia. I could see that, having been a mainstream journalist for so many years, I suddenly realized that here was a way that I could reach out to ordinary folk who were all getting online with great enthusiasm in the urban areas of Malaysia and East Malaysia, round about that time, which was 2010. And I thought, well, I tried on a few occasions to get some films going, some outside interest from media in the UK and US, and really not much global interest in this huge story. And I realized, apart from me, there weren't many journalists who were taking any kind of lasting interest in what I felt was an enormous story on both a human level and environmental level. And so I started to come to the conclusion that I should use this new tool that existed, not to try and get the attention of foreign audiences, but to actually speak directly to people in Malaysia. Because if anything was going to be done about this, it would have to be the Malaysians that did it. They were prevented at that time from getting the information they needed to make decisions that I felt sure they would agree with most good people needed to be made, by the fact that Malaysia, but particularly Sarawak, was operating an incredibly oppressive media environment. There were some wonderful journalists and would-be journalists that I met in Sarawak, and of course they couldn't begin to openly come out and say what was going on or investigate, because there was total control over the media. Not only was the media owned by Taib and his conglomerate of associated family businesses, and the logging business, which it was all one organism really. If anyone was to speak out, the consequences would be very severe. Not just in terms of losing your job and it being taken out on your family members, whatever job they might have. The mafia that was running that country would get at them. But there were plenty of laws in place also that would enable the authorities to accuse you of sedition, going against the government, and so forth. So it really was impossible for them to talk out. And so I felt invited, I was invited to start writing from the safety of my home in London about these issues. And something I'd like to say, particularly as there's so many Malaysians here, I would like to say I could never have done this without the amazing support, assistance, warmth, and encouragement of so many Malaysians, some of whom I knew and met, and others who contacted me anonymously to give me very, very useful information that I could then research further on and start to build stories around. So I was doing something, and I knew that very soon I knew that I was somehow becoming part of a movement to get out information about all these problems and about all this oppression. So that continued, and very soon I found that I was getting staggering numbers of hits on my little website. I began by really zooming in on the nexus of the problem, which was the unbelievable overriding control that one man, Taib Mahmood, had over this chunk of an island that was the size of the British Isles combined, and probably the most resource-rich place on the planet. Sarawak has everything, and indeed a lot of that wealth has just been siphoned out and benefited West Malaysia, and the rest has benefited the cabal that run Sarawak. And Taib himself had benefited from the fact that he'd come to Australia and was an educated lawyer here at Adelaide University, which he then lavished his own largesse on from his inexplained wealth. And he also benefited from the fact that his uncle had been chief minister before him of Sarawak, and backed by the central Malaysian government that wanted to have a regime in place that was cooperative, obviously. Taib had done a deal together with his uncle with the central government in Malaysia in 1974, which was known as the Petroleum Development Act. And that effective deal was to sign over Sarawak's petroleum reserves to Petronas in return for a tacit agreement that the Mahmood family would then be left alone to exploit the rest of what Sarawak had to offer in terms of economic opportunity. And what's very interesting about that particular act, which was something that Najib, Taib attempted to exploit actually just before this upcoming election, by extracting a promise from Najib that it would be rescinded and that in future Sarawak could have its own access to its own oil for the first time. What was interesting about that act was that it was illegal, in that Taib and his uncle had never had it ratified as was required by the Sarawak State Parliament. I think they rightly judged they would not have got something like that through the State Parliament, which was the surrender of its most valuable state resource for nothing in return, and for a mere obligation of 5% that was extracted to come back in principle into Sarawak from its oil stream. So in return for that, Taib had been allowed to accumulate vast powers, probably unprecedented powers for a state ruler in any federation that one could imagine. He had autonomy over his borders. He occupied every, relevant position in the state government. He was the chief minister, he was the finance minister, he was the planning and resources minister, he was the custodian of the Land Custody and Development Authority, which was a very pernicious organisation that he set up within a very short time of taking office, which was basically sort of in charge of, what it became in charge of was sequestering native lands, alienating native lands, and handing out plantation licenses on those lands. And of course the Timber Development Council, all of these bodies were under his direct control, as was everything else in Sarawak. He had spent 20 years accumulating monopolies, privatising state industries into his family's possession, and making sure that any half-decent contracts went again to his own family companies. Tybe has to be one of the richest people on the planet, secretly. And what I set about doing, for starters, I felt that the information I could bring to people in Sarawak was to actually show how that wealth was being invested abroad. I started looking at the foreign properties that Tybe Mahmood had in Australia, in Canada, UK, and America. It was only the tip of the iceberg, but what I was able to demonstrate was that this family, and Tybe himself, had hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property strewn out across the developed economies, for which there was no legitimate explanation. This young man had left Adelaide University and pretty much gone into public office, was a public servant with a modest public salary. So this caused stirs in Sarawak. To jump forward a little bit, I soon realised that I was knocking my head against a brick wall. And of course, I was never sure that I would create any impact with what I was doing. I mean, I was doing this because I felt at the very least it should be recorded and people should know. But I could see that despite the fact that the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission had taken note, and there had been investigations into Tybe, there was nothing coming out of the federal government run by Najib Razak. There were no actions that were going to be taken against Tybe. And indeed, I'd gone next door to Sabah, where an equally noxious character named Musa Aman, who might just be the person who's having a little interview at the moment with the police, he was also playing the same games. He had developed an enormous grip on the Sabah economy. And again, thanks to insiders, thanks to whistleblowing information, I laid my hands on a series of extremely interesting bank account details that showed how hundreds of millions of dollars worth of timber kickbacks were being circulated round offshore companies, BVI companies, with bank accounts in first HSBC and then UBS in Singapore and Hong Kong, through to Musa's private Swiss bank accounts in Zurich, UBS Bank. I published all of that in 2012. Again, nothing happening, although satisfyingly, the Swiss authorities took this up, and UBS is now the target of a prosecution for assisting money laundering in Switzerland. It's been a very slow, grinding process, but like Goldman Sachs, this very, very big international bank is now facing prosecution over this assistance in the theft of Malaysia's wealth. But nothing doing in Malaysia. And by 2013, I realized that nothing was going to happen because the corruption, of course, as it always does, had begun at the top. And at that point, I started raising my eyes to the pinnacle of power in Malaysia, the Prime Minister himself. And it became very evident to me, and I just had to read about this couple who were running Malaysia in a very ostentatiously, wealthy fashion, but also it was a very, very strange regime that had already become very clear to Malaysians. There was a very, very strange regime that had taken over in the form of Mr. and Mrs. Najib. And the ostentatious spending was out of a league compared to previous prime ministers that had gone before. There was this strange association with this very flamboyant proxy of Najib's and close friend of Rosmer and Rosmer's son. We were seeing more and more criticism coming out from the opposition in particular over this fund that Najib had set up shortly after taking power, 1MDB. And 1MDB had caught my eye already because it had dabbled in Sarawak. So I had sort of noted that, and in particular, I had noted that the first joint venture partner, so-called joint venture partner of 1MDB, which was this before unheard of company called Petroleum, which appeared to be run by a bunch of young kids one of whom did happen to be the seventh son of the then King of Saudi Arabia. But they were young, sort of jet-set kids who were friendly, somehow, it seemed, with the circle of Najib's sons and Joe Low. These guys suddenly came in, having done this joint venture with 1MDB a year later, and bought out one of Tide Mahmood's big conglomerates, UBG and Sarawak. So that had attracted my attention. I couldn't help but noticing that Joe Low had come in a bit earlier and bought half share of that conglomerate before the whole thing was then bought out at a very good price not by 1MDB, by this Petro-Saudi company. But there were many people wondering if this structure, this 1MDB structure, was involved in that purchase. So very rapidly, I'll tell you, 1MDB was set up supposedly as a development fund. It had this very strange sort of modus of operandi, which was that Najib had announced that 1MDB would be borrowing large sums of money, and then, you know, somehow would be an entrepreneurial government initiative, whereby that borrowed money would then be invested in thriving businesses, and then the money would be, you know, that profit would go into helping the poor develop. And of course what was happening was that they were borrowing exponential sums of money at very high rates of interest in a very opaque manner, and no one was sure at all how the money was being invested. There was this sort of cloak of a joint venture deal with this strange new company from nowhere called Petro-Saudi, which nearly $2 billion was initially invested into that company. And then there was no accounting for it. And you know, opposition politicians like Anwar, before he was clamped in jail, and then you know, Tony Blair in particular, and Rafizi Ramli were saying, you know, could we just have the annual accounts, please? You know, could we just find out where all these billions have gone? And 1MDB, a government fund, was dragging its feet on its annual accounts. One set came in 18 months late. They got through three sets of accountants in the first few years. So there was a lot of suspicion, concern, a lack of transparency about 1MDB, which by the time I started looking at it was $11 billion in the red and unexplained. And I started to wonder if, you know, maybe this was another story. Indeed it was, and I can tell you a little bit more about it, but I really started reporting on 1MDB because it emerged in plain sight that something was going wrong. The end of 2013, a movie came out, Wolf of Wall Street, and I had been tipped off that the producer of that movie was the son of Rosmer, stepson of Najib. And this tickled me, you know, this was Christmas of 2013, and we were just seeing this Leo DiCaprio blockbuster coming up on the billboards, and there was a lot of righteous dismay at what this film represented. It was about stealing people's money and then having a whale of a time spending it, and it was a, you know, it was film packed with sex, drugs, and misbehaviour, and there was a lot of upset about that from a moral point of view, so I was therefore gobsmacked when I got this tip that Rosmer was proposing to education officials that children in Malaysia should be shown this in schools. So I first started looking at this as a, you know, well, what a hypocritical sounding, you know, situation, and now I find that the son is the producer. So I started looking at this over the Christmas break, actually, and very soon it became apparent that this was a $100 million movie where the financing was obscure. And I was thinking, well, you know, so I looked into young Weezer and realized very soon that he was, you know, he was from nowhere. He'd not started on his career yet. He'd had a couple of low-level banking jobs. So, you know, as I dug a bit further, what's going on here? And there was just this moment as I started going through the cuts online, and I realized that everywhere Weezer went in Hollywood, at his side, on all the launch occasions, you know, with Margot Robbie and Leo DiCaprio on either side and Martin Scorsese. In every shot was Joe Low, this guy who was associated with Weezer's stepdad's mysteriously unsuccessful development fund project. So I really kicked this off by doing what a journalist should do, which is observe and then ask valid questions. And my valid question in this case was, where did Weezer get the money from to fund a $100 million movie in which he had said he had skin in the game? Could it have anything to do with the fact that, you know, he's in a close friendship and there is a close relationship between Joe Low and the movie, given that Joe Low is the known advisor to the 1MDB fund that Weezer's stepdad manages, which has been losing billions of dollars. You know, in particular, Leo DiCaprio had gone on stage and had thanked Joe and Weezer for taking the risk on the movie. So, you know, there really was a very strong insinuation that Joe had been funding this movie, and I got some very harsh pushback on that, and lots of legal letters, and of course that whetted my appetite. I thought, oh, this has hurt them. You know, they're worried about this, and they don't seem to be able to answer the question. More to the point. So I started digging from the beginning of 2014. And I dug, I showed that, you know, I could present how time and again Joe was making, and Weezer were making statements that I could, through open source research, prove were inaccurate and untrue. In particular, Joe started saying that he wasn't involved with 1MDB. He just had a very short advisory period way back in 2009. Well, I was able to show through open source research that he'd been involved in a major $1 billion hotel buyout bid in 2011, backed by 1MDB money. So I knew he was lying, and I wrote, well, he's not telling the truth about this. And so it went on until I started to get feedback coming in, and I learned that there was a whistleblower out there who I'm sure many of you know about, Xavier Justo. Xavier Justo was a former director of PetroSaudi. He'd come in after the deals with 1MDB in order to help invest some of the money that company had made from that deal, had very soon fallen out with his former comrades, had realized there was something very odd going on, had left the company and had taken the company server with him. And had then retired to Thailand, where he was opening up a leisure business with his new wife, and had started flicking through the material and had realized that there was something very big that had gone down here. And as any experienced investigative journalist will tell you, in the end, if you're really going to have a big, big story, you're going to have to get the insider information. Xavier Justo was one of the early insiders that helped me get to the nub and actually get a hook on 1MDB and start to ratchet down the story and get Najib on the run. That was the first hook I got on the story, when I was able to unveil the fact that out of the first $1 billion that had gone into 1MDB, into the joint investment, 700 million had gone to Joe Low's company, an offshore entity called Weezer. Now, as you probably realize, I can talk about this subject for a long time, and I'm looking at the clock and I can see that it's time I gave you a chance to tell me what interests you most about this whole story, and to turn this over to questions. I'll just leave this with one thought that I would like you to really take away, because what I think the most important, particularly for us here in Australia, thing to remember about what happened with 1MDB is that this was not just an isolated case of corruption in one country. What 1MDB has done is shine the light on a global system that allows this kind of kleptocracy to continue to abuse the the wealth and welfare of vulnerable people in less well-governed areas of the world, thanks to the willing collaboration of professionals in the West. And without the support of international banks, lawyers, accountants, and particularly the whole offshore incorporation industry and the offshore finance industry with which these regular banks happily interface in order to wealth manage the vast sums of money that are being siphoned out of countries like Sarawak and Malaysia by corrupt local entities. If it wasn't for that system, then it would not be possible for these enormous thefts to be made. And up till now, our regulators, our politicians in places like Australia and in the United States and in Britain have not been dealing with this problem. And it's not just a joint culpability that we have for this, it actually affects all of us as well. And this is a problem for the receiver countries where this massive investment of criminal cash that has been extracted from crime in certain areas of the world, it goes without monitoring, without tax, through the offshore system into the hands of criminally inclined people in our economies to make our, buying up our properties, influencing our systems, having undue weight over decision making in our democracies. It's a threat to Western democracies as well as to countries like Malaysia, who so nearly went into the dark of tyranny, with what we saw with the lashback that was initiated by Najib when he realised he was going to have to defend himself against the exposés of 1MDB. As you well know, he cracked down. It was very lucky that Malaysia managed to extract that election out of him, and lucky indeed that he thought he was going to be able to win it, and even luckier that the people of Malaysia had got the message thanks to journalism, thanks to the story getting out. They united, put aside their other differences, and went into that ballot box with a wave that brushed out this immensely powerful government that no one thought could be dislodged. So we need to think about all those things and consider how we address these problems in our financial systems. Thank you.
Because 100 years ago, there was another report called the Sarawak Report that changed the world. It was a report by Wallace. It was an observation of species in Sarawak, which then inspired Darwin, his whole thesis of evolution of species. And I thought your report, Sarawak Report from Sarawak is incredible, uncanny. My question for you, if I may ask, is that put Joe aside as the blink of the whole issue, Joe Low. My question here is that are there enough evidences now gathered by the American government, Singapore government, Swiss government, and Hong Kong to implicate and prosecute a whole lot of crooks in Australia and worldwide? And what's the role of J-Lo? Is it more or less this bling emotional how is J-Lo? Is J-Lo really a key to unravel all this, or as I said, Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, and the US have enough information to hang all these bastards? Sorry, I'm just being crude here as explanation.
Well, actually, the reforming new government in Malaysia, one of its first moves was to abolish hanging. So you're going to be disappointed in that. We of course saw the indictment finally by the United States against Jolo last week, and it makes very interesting reading. And if you don't want to pay, I shouldn't say this, but if you don't want to pay for it by going online in the United States, you can find it on my website for free. The evidence is just overwhelming. And the reason for this is the dollar clearing system. I actually presented my information very early on to the newly formed US kleptocracy asset recovery unit that had been set up in 2014, because belatedly, the United States, the Obama administration at least, had come to recognize this mutual threat that criminal cash has, not only to countries that lose it, but to those that receive it. And the point of the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative was to start to pick up on these kleptocrats who were pouring criminal money into the United States. I knew about its existence and I contacted them and was thrilled and delighted when they took up this case. I don't think they actually needed much of my information once they'd identified the crime, because they can trace every damned cent pretty much, thanks to the clearing system that they control, US soft power. So therefore they got to work on just tracing the money that had come out from 1MDB. It was all in dollars, of course, because you know what, you don't want to, you know, who wants ringgit? You want to be able to we want ringgit. It should have been in ringgit. It should have been invested in Malaysia, but these crooks didn't. And so therefore they were able to trace all of this, and it's all there in the indictment. And I do find, this all of course originally came out with the civil cases that were laid first one in July 2016. And you could see there what had happened to the money, and Najib was denying it. And again, it's just such fun. A latest update from this morning is that Utazan, you know, the feared propaganda tool for so many years of the BN government, has rounded this morning on Najib to condemn him for lying over 1MDB. And of course, you know, for months and years, Utazan was the mouthpiece of those lies. But now they're saying, come on, Najib, how much longer are you going to go on trying to pretend in the face of this hard evidence produced by the United States and of course other governments, Singapore in particular, Switzerland, into this whole scandal. So yeah, that's my answer. I think it's pretty, it's there, hard evidence, and bit by bit we're seeing people being picked up and caught up with.
Thank you.
Down the back, please.
Good afternoon, Jaginder Singh. First of all, I think Malaysia owes a debt of thanks to you for working so hard and behind the scene for bringing about this perfect storm of change. My question to you is regarding red granite. With the settlement that they had with the Department of Justice, that they only have to pay 60 million. How does did they get away with it? This seems to us laymen, it's like they just got away with it, like a slap on the wrist.
I think one of the things that one has to remember when these settlements are arrived at is that that's not the end of it. Malaysia also has a right to prosecute these individuals, and now they're getting on with it, now that Najib's been overthrown. The public of Malaysia have already made their judgment, even the courts haven't. The Court of Public Opinion has already ruled in Malaysia, and they want 1MDB to be investigated. All of these individuals who've lost their profits to a large extent in the United States are still in danger of losing their freedom if they're found guilty, for example, in a court of law in Malaysia, where I think Weezer Aziz still is, and he's probably going to find it difficult to go travelling at any time soon.
Oh, with all the figures bandied about, I'm just confused. I thought there were 3 bond raisings. How much was the total of the 3 bond raisings? How much actually went back to 1MDB, or was that 0? And what was the balance that disappeared? And of the balance that disappeared was only 680 US million traced to Najib. So Jolo and his cronies got the rest.
Oh dear, there are always people who want the figures. You're going to have to read my book, it's all in there. As I say, I struggled with all of this. The simple figure from the bonds was quite straightforward, 6.5 billion. There were 3 bonds. The first 2 were so-called private purchase bonds, 1.75 billion each, and then the last one was 3 billion, just before the 2013 election, which is what it was raised for. It was interesting to read in the indictments against Joe Low by the DOJ on Friday, that Goldman Sachs had actually deliberately found the most expensive way of borrowing money for 1MDB that they could, in order to make money for the bank, for themselves, and to find presumably, multiple paths for stealing it. And in fact, they could have raised the money far more cheaply for the objectives that were certainly being expressed as being the purpose of the bond. But of course, these were, the purpose of the bond was to steal a lot of money. I think now, I think about, out of the first two, so the 3.5 billion that were raised in Project Magnolia and Project Maximus, that were what the two power purchase bonds were coded as. I think 1.4 billion was detoured out. So what happened was they constructed, thanks to their co-conspirators at the Abar Sovereign Wealth Fund, and I haven't talked about KAQ, who was, just makes Joe Low look like a kind of cheap spender, actually. He was the guy who had got, had become the golden boy of Abu Dhabi and was Sheikh Mansour's right-hand man. He was the first guy actually to get clapped in jail over the 1MDB scandal. Now KAQ received a backhanders of $500 million through his Edmund de Rothschild private bank account. And very handily, I was contacted by somebody who had those details, had the statements, and passed them to me quite early on in the 1MDB story, and I was able to show how CAC, as he was known, had received that money through a company which I then, at that time, didn't realise the significance of, Blackstone Asia Real Estate Partners. And what is this big US, company doing, getting involved in all of this? But CAC was spending like mad as a facilitator for all these deals, and what they did was set up a whole structure of false guarantee payments and so on for the bond. That Abar agreed, together with their co-conspirator Joe Low and the Goldman guys. They came up with this construct of funneling billions of dollars to pay for these guarantees into bogus Abar funds. So CAC set up a bogus Abar subsidiary in an offshore company. Well, there were four of them actually, but there was particularly one in the BVI. And the money went to BSI Bank originally, and then from BSI, 1.4 billion was eventually funneled to the bogus offshore account of Abar, and then from there funneled on through to pay off all the conspirators. That was how it was detoured out. So huge chunks of money stolen.
We'll wait for someone else with a question.
Hi, Nick John. Just this morning I was just leaving home and just telling my wife how incredibly brave you are on this. And given that what's has happened around Malaysia to the people involved in 1MDB or in transactions and all that, do you have any kind of it might be relevant for future whistleblowers and reporters who wants to report and stuff like that? What kind of protection do you have, or do you take any personal protection, or do you have any help in that area? And the second question is, what do you think of the recent Jazeera interview of Najib?
Well, I had fun writing about that, what possessed Najib's people to suggest that he should sit down and submit to questioning, that they don't deserve to be in the communications business. And my comment on that was that if Najib needed any demonstration that he should plead guilty and not attempt to face cross-examination in the dock, that was it, because you can't stomp out of the dock, and so he should cut a deal and save everyone, including himself and all of Malaysia, a lot of embarrassment and humiliation, and just accept the game is up. But of course he won't, so the Najib show will continue. On the bravery side, I had my share of threats, but in the Khashoggi scale of danger to journalists. I could see that I had I was operating in a law-abiding country where there was a police station down the road, which I did occasionally have to go and report harassment to. Compare that to the unbelievably brave stance taken by so many Malaysians who were living and sticking their necks out and speaking out in KL and elsewhere in Malaysia at that time when Najib was getting really nasty as he was trying to crack down and intimidate. And we all know about some of the cases of disappearances and murders that seem to be extremely uncomfortably connected and close to what was happening at 1MDB. So, I bore in mind that there were other people taking far greater risks than I was, and on that basis, I wasn't going to let them down.
Fozil from Murdoch University. Now, we all have, there's been enough hard evidence to get so many key figures in this whole 1MDB case, and a number of them have been arrested. But the one man that everyone's after is still out there, Joe Low. So apparently he's somewhere in China, and I think he's adopting the character of Catch Me If You Can, Leonardo DiCaprio, where he's quite been out there, knowing that he's committed enough crimes. He's still trying to do more, because I think in August when Mahathir was going to China, apparently he through Tom Wright, the writer of $1 Billion Whale, he tried to get hold of Mahathir to offer him some contacts in China that I can help you do business with. So why, with all this evidence and international police involved, is he still out there not being arrested? Do you know?
I've got a pretty good idea, yes. This has become a geopolitical issue. 1MDB has shone a light on so much, and not just on nefarious activities by Western banks, but also on dodgy maneuvers by the Chinese government in pursuing its Belt and Road policy and the normal superpower practices, which we see not just from China, but from other big superpowers who are trying to exert greater influence in areas they would like to extend their reach into. And with Najib on the run from the United States and in deep financial trouble, he kind of fell like a soggy plum into the lap of the Chinese government, who was seeking to extend its influence into Malaysia naturally. So they allowed him to really get involved in some extremely dirty arrangements with state-owned companies in China, which involved, and I was delighted, it was one of my proudest scoops, thanks to some whistleblowing, which is that I received the secret arrangement by which the East Coast Railway link had been inflated in its projected cost by 100%. And that extra 30 billion that had raised the cost suddenly from projected 30 billion to 60 billion there was actually a manifest that had been written out, which included, every tick box that Najib and Joe Low wanted, including all the repayments that were necessary on 1MDB, dates and amounts that Najib could not find the money because it had been stolen to repay, and a bunch of Joe Low's dodgy companies as well. And I'd published that. And so really, it's very embarrassing for the Chinese government. They've been caught out. They didn't think, they bet on the wrong horse. Najib did not, as every single expert in the world had said would inevitably happen. He did not win the election, he lost it. I think China is embarrassed that they send back Joe Low, that all this is going to come out and their willing participation in these dirty contracts is going to come out. So there's a lot of geopolitical and diplomatic negotiation going on at the moment as to under what terms Malaysia and China are going to come to an agreement over the return of Joe Low. Although one senior Malaysian official did say that he was confident that eventually Joe Low would be returned like a panda in a cage as a gift from China to face justice in Malaysia.
Based on your reply then, I don't think my strategy of inviting Joe Low to give a public seminar here at the Asia Research Centre would quite entrap him. Let the person there, please, who hasn't had a question so far.
I've got one question. First, sorry, I'm Malkith, a retired academic, terribly interested in whatever happened in Malaysia recently, but still a Malaysian. I'm very disturbed that, in my mind, Taib Mahmud seems to be a much bigger kleptocrat than Najib, and a smarter guy. He keeps his money under wraps. And yet, there's an ominous silence about charging him or getting to him. The government seems to be rather reluctant to move against him. Your opinion, please.
Well, you'll not miss the fact that the title of my book is The Sarawak Report. And if you do get a chance to read it, you'll see that I pretty much end on that thought. I started on this because I saw an injustice that needed to be highlighted. And I found myself, entering an extraordinary adventure, with this enormous story. But the injustice remains in Sarawak. And in this election, the fact that the tsunami stopped at the state borders of Sarawak. Even Sabah, they swept away Musa, who is, I gather, having a conversation now with the police. But it did not sweep away Sarawak, which was so tightly controlled, thanks to the fact that you had this regime that was immensely rich and with a sparse and vulnerable, scattered population of local communities that are not in a position to rally against vote buying, control of votes, and all the rest. That is something that needs reforming. And of course, as the new government tries to bed down, consolidate, and deal with the immediate problems, you can see that the Sarawak issue is not on the front of their concerns. It's not on the top of the pile. Not least because the enormous revenue is still coming in from Sarawak. Actually, they went back very quickly on that deal to take their own oil after the election, I noticed. There doesn't seem to be any more said about that manoeuvre to undo the Petronas deal. That very convenient source of income is still coming into the federal government, which understandably they want to hang on to. And these issues remain. A fairer deal for Sarawak must be achieved. And I, for one, will join others in campaigning for that.
Thank you very much. We're just a little bit over time, and I think we'll have to stop it there. 2 words come to say.
10 minutes. We've got 10 minutes.
Oh, we have, okay.
Yes.
I thought we were going to be the other place at 10:30.
No.
Okay, forget it. Questions? Carol and you, please. You've already had a question, so if there's no more later, we'll come back to you. So Carol, and then over there.
I'd just like you to speculate on what would have happened if Najib had won. How long would it have taken for all of this emerged without that radical?
Yes, thank you for making that very important point, because I think everyone in Malaysia realised as we approached that all-important watershed of GE14 that this was a black and white situation. If Najib had won, the prospects for Malaysia were incredibly grim. We'd already identified him as a reckless, ruthless spender under the grip of an out-of-control wife, to be frank. The level of pillage of public finances was unrestrained, and you can see how corruption can bring a country to its knees very, very quickly. You would have seen Najib taking advantage of that election win to say that he'd been vindicated, but nonetheless he was a cornered and damaged public figure who would have always been under pressure because of his obvious guilt that everyone was aware of. So therefore he would have cracked down. He would have had to have had a very, very tyrannical regime, I think, to have kept control. And you would have seen Malaysia slip economically into sort of disaster zone and into the control of the neighbouring superpower that was about to extend total economic grasp over the country through debt. So it was a really, really frightening situation for Malaysians. and instead, they've managed to show that they could peacefully change the government through the ballot box without a bloody nose in the process. And now you're seeing a renewed country with a very, very strong understanding of what makes for a democracy, what protects a democracy. There's a strong reform movement to strengthen institutions that have become eroded in order to protect the public against that sort of corruption, unfettered ability by a handful of people to run the country as if it was their personal decision making. And the current government are really working to re-establish strong governments in Malaysia. We can see Malaysia now emerging as a beacon nation for positive change in Southeast Asia. How fantastic, and well done to all those Malaysians who made a sensible vote.
Thank you. Just to continue on that line, you did talk about sorry, it's Peter Wilkins. I'm an honorary research fellow at the School of Public Policy at the university here. You talked about the global system that enabled the kleptocracy, but could you talk a little bit more about the changes that you just indicated are afoot and the transparency around those? Because clearly it's very important that changes that are made to public institutions and the people who hold the key positions, that all of that is happening transparently, otherwise there is always the great risk of events recurring.
Are you talking about within Malaysia or in our financial dealing with global financial?
No, within Malaysia. I accept that it's going to be a very slow road on the global issues.
Yes, well, I'm probably not the best person to opine on this. I think I can assure that the people who are in key positions now in government have spent their entire political careers as reformists thinking about what needs to be done to strengthen democracy in Malaysia, and probably never imagined that they were going to get the chance to actually put their principles into action. So the motivation is there, and I think all of us are anxious that this opportunity, this chance is not lost. So yes, there seems to be some slowness in the changes. We're sort of sitting waiting for sort of mass repeals, for example, of oppressive media laws and other vital things to take place. We have to bear in mind that this government walked into a crisis situation economically, and has also taken over, like icing on a cake, a deeply entrenched regime, which is still run by people who have been part of the past 60 years of BN government. So I know that a lot of the ministers are finding, that institutional obstruction is still hard to get over, and it's going to be a very, very hard, long struggle for them to achieve. But I generally the will is there.
Just a quick one there. You alluded to the Singaporean report. I'm just wondering to what extent would the Singaporean financial institutions, parties or unwitting parties or simply all conduits to the whole 1MDB situation?
Yes, I think Singapore's one of the great financial centres that enables all this to go on, as is Britain and our wonderful offshore system, as is Delaware, and those Cayman Islands. Yes, I think it's been a very tricky one for Singapore. And my guess is that Singapore and Switzerland, another of these centres, took action because America did on this. And I think we all know that these squeaky clean financial centres have become very good at not picking up on the origin of the cash that they are very correctly processing once it arrives with them. And that's why we need to get at the offshore system, in my view.
I'll just ask a question. Just picking up on that point about how the bureaucracy is entrenched. Probably 2 generations of people who are beneficiaries. The private sector is also complicit in that they were beneficiaries. Do you have any comment on that? Apart from the banking sector, there would be so many industries that would have benefited, e.g. the Sarawak case and Sabah, but similarly also in West Malaysia, I would imagine.
Well, it has been pointed out to me, and you probably know even more about it, that several of the businessmen who seem to sort of disappear from view for a while after May 9th have started reappearing in KL, and clearly in many quarters, you know, a wish for business to get back to normal, and you know, attempts to get cosy with anyone who might be biddable in that. So there's obviously that worry, and there is an enormous amount of money in the hands of these powerful businesses, and you know, certain formerly powerful political entities. And you know, we can look at regimes that have changed. I think Indonesia was one, and the Philippines another, where you see you know, highly discredited regimes that are kicked out from power, and then thanks to their money and connections, you see, you know, relatives and the regimes themselves, people connected to those old regimes, you know, creeping back into positions of influence quite soon after. So you know, there's a lot of hard work for Malaysia to try and make this all continue to go in the right direction.
If I can just ask a question. You mentioned in the course of your presentation that this whole fiasco really has implications for authorities outside of Malaysia, including Australia. And you've been on the east coast of Australia giving some presentations before you came here. Do you get any sense that activists who may have been attending your presentations are interested in the follow-up to that, given that we've got a forthcoming election, possible change of government? Someone like Penny Wong, who's, if I'm not wrong, born in East Malaysia too, may have a better than average interest in this sort of thing, or maybe not. But the question has been raised a couple of times from various writers in Malaysia, and I've not seen much public response from Australia. So I just wonder, is there any indication this might be changing, or whether the people you bumped into in the course of your short visit so far who have an enthusiasm for taking this up in Australia?
Well, I was censored in my interview with ABC at one point, because in my interview I talked about my concerns about the failure of Australian authorities to tackle ANZ Bank for starters, and its involvement in the AN Bank fiasco in KL. And I pointed out that, you know, you had $1 billion bank account which was seeing hundreds of millions coming in regular payments in the name of the Prime Minister of the day, and this was being managed by AN Bank, the major shareholder of which was ANZ Bank, and all the key office holders at AN Bank in KL were on secondment from ANZ. That was the ad for the bank. You can deal with AN Bank, it's really ANZ. That was the message. And yet when the cat was out of the bag, these people all flew away, and there has been no action, no investigation into why it was that senior professionals from ANZ Bank were overseeing what they could only have known about, which was this outrageous bank account, this outrageous criminal bank account. Now, that got censored by ABC's lawyers. I don't think it should have been. I think that's what journalists are there to do, to raise issues about major public institutions and major questions of public interest. And if ANZ have got a convincing answer to this question of mine, then they should just come out and give it to me. But to shovel this under the carpet is worrying, and there was a great deal of complicity between the Australian authorities and the Najib government, and your former Prime Minister Tony Abbott tactlessly tweeted when the election result was announced, instead of congratulating the new government, reforming government with a reform agenda, he tweeted how sad it was that a good friend of Australia, Najib Razak, had been kicked out of office. So you know, this doesn't go down well, and You know, I think Australia should welcome, you know, a vibrant new democratic force in the region and seek to work with it and assist it.
Thank you. And just to be sure, that question that's going on our website won't be censored at all. Please feel free to send the URL to any politician who might be a local member or anybody else, any journalist, and they can see the whole presentation by Clare and not just those questions. We now actually have just gone over time, so it's my great pleasure now to thank Clare. The two words that come to mind immediately are congratulations and thanks. Congratulations, not just on a brilliant career, but on following the trail of investigation that you did in such a courageous and impressive way to bring about a huge impact and give so many people some hope that many of the corrupt practices and other difficulties that they've been having to deal with for so long now, as you say, can be potentially reformed to some degree or another. So in terms of your professional influence and impact, there are many people to be both thankful and to congratulate you for. And I think everyone here is thankful and wants to congratulate you on that work. And I ask you to show your appreciation one final time.
Perhaps I could present you, Garrett, with a special copy of the Sarawak Report. Maybe you might want to put in your library or even read yourself.
Thank you very much. Well, I was at the train back to Singapore on the weekend. This was on sale there. $4, and I thought, it's a cheaper one. I didn't realise how much cheaper.